managed to get the tank landing craft a bit closer to the distillery. And then the big moment happened when eventually it was close enough, and Big Beanie, where they managed to start up the engine, just rolled into the distillery. And then during Friday, they moved all the other equipment and what have you. And the operation was completed on the Saturday, and the boat pulled away on the Sunday morning.
Everyone must have been quite thrilled once that was over then.
Oh, God. There's some pictures there's a picture of me leaning on the harbour wall, looking as though I'm about to be absolutely sick.
Welcome back to the Whisky Legends podcast, where I speak to my granddad Tim Morrison about how the industry has developed over the last 100 years. In this episode, we'll hear about how my great grandad purchased Bowmore on Islay, how my granddad oversaw a tank landing craft and super crane named Big Beanie eventually managed to transport brand new stills and boiler into the distillery, and what this meant for the business in developing the vatted malt program and the export of bulk blends, as well as the purchase of another distillery called Glen Garioch. Perfect. So last episode we sort of finished on what was about to take SPM to the next level, and that was obviously the purchase of Bowmore Distillery, which is now one of the biggest whiskey brands on the planet. How did that purchase come about?
That came about because my father was having lunch in the Malmaison restaurant in the Central Hotel in Glasgow, with one or two of his great friends. And at the next table, there was a lady, Kay Grigger, whose husband had been a friend of my father's, and my father knew Kay pretty well. And she was with two Spaniards. And during the lunch, my father overheard them talking about the disposal of Bowmore Distillery. And so when lunch was over, he called Kay and asked if he could meet her. And they had dinner together and discussed the possibility of Stanley Morrison, buying Bowmore Distillery. And because basically he thought it would be better for the distillery to remain in the industry and not to be taken out by the Spaniards, who were dealing in bulk whisky at that time.
And what would have happened if the Spaniards did buy it? What would have happened to it?
Well, I suppose that it would have been used primarily for the Spaniards' bulk whisky supplies,
yeah.
And I think that you would have had a distillery taken out of the industry, and I don't think it certainly wouldn't have had the respect given to it that it should have perhaps have had. However, fortunately, Kay was persuaded that this would be a good idea, and so my father advised his partner at the time, James Howitt, that he had bought Bowmore.
So he's advised him he had already bought it.
He advised him that he had already bought it. Howitt asked him how much he was intending paying for it, which I believe was about 340,000. And to which Howitt said, "How do you intend paying for it?" And my father's response as he walked out the door was, "That's your problem." Howitt was the financial director of Stanley P. Morrison at the time.
Yeah. So he was happy about that then?
Well, my father got his way, so I think they managed to move on some stock, which
Yeah.
helped in terms of the overall price they
Yeah.
paid for it.
And quite possibly Bowmore as it is today, without that happening, may not be there. It may be...
Who knows what might have happened to Bowmore?
Yeah.
Because quite frankly, it was in a mess. It, and I remember going to see it the first time. But in those days, of course, distilleries that were there to distill, they weren't there for visitors.
Yeah.
And so consequently, you had coal heaps all over the place, peat bings all over the place. There was no attempt at polishing stills or polishing pipes or things like that. And there was a general air of unkemptness about them, and the warehouses were painted not with paint but with lime. They had the romanticism, but they didn't have the sweetness to go with them. At that time. You didn't really get any excitement out of going round a distillery because invariably it was a bloody mess.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously James Howitt would have had one reaction. What was your reaction to...
I was delighted.
Yeah.
Because this was going to bring us into malt distilling, and it was going to put Stanley P. Morrison into a different league in the industry.
Yeah. And it obviously still, wasn't like it was a single malt whiskey brand like we know it today.
Nothing.
I mean, what was the significance? What were the opportunities that it gave you?
It gave us the opportunity to exchange our production with other companies within the industry, other distilling, blending companies within the industry.
Yeah.
So that instead of having to buy our fillings, we could exchange our whisky from Bowmore with other companies, and that was a huge bonus to us, because not only did we manage to get the exchanges, but we were also got cash fillings as well, which were of huge benefit.
What do you mean cash fillings?
Well, companies would buy whiskey for cash. I mean, check.
Yeah. And did you have, like, where was the warehouse and?
Well, Bowmore had their own warehouses.
Yeah. So you had that all within the deal.
All within the deal, but not only that, which nobody really realised at the time, was that we, within that deal, owned the Roseburn Bond and the Roseburn Cooperage. And they were warehouses, or a huge warehouse in Glasgow, and we had a cooperage, which employed probably about 4 or 5 people, and we had blending facilities. Not bottling, but blending facilities.
Right, okay. So that allowed you to have your own blend.
Instead of having to go and find other people to do the blending for us, we were then able to do that ourselves.
Got you. Okay. And then, so what was the sort of, after you've been at Bowmore, what were the significant changes that then allowed you to take it up even another level?
Well, what also happened at that time, which was very fortuitous, was that Highland Distilleries had closed down Bunnahabhain Distillery to totally recondition the whole place. And we had another still house with 2 different stills, 2 big John Doe stills in it, which we didn't and wouldn't use. But nevertheless, they were there. Now, these stills actually produced an entirely different style of whisky to the stills in the main still house, which is extraordinary considering, you have the same barley, the same malt, the same mash, the same fermentation, and then it goes into 2 different stills and out comes 2 different spirits.
I guess that's the magic of whisky, isn't it?
That's right. And so we were then approached by John MacPhail of Highland Distilleries, and they were keen to buy 2 years of production from us, from the John Doe stills. So we were then able to run both still houses.
Yeah. And I guess focus a lot of your efforts on other things that you'd usually having to be, selling that stock, that spirit, where actually you had 2 years of it already signed off, so you could focus elsewhere.
Yeah. And in the meantime, we had some changes within the management, and we decided that if we were going to be more efficient, or be as efficient as we possibly could do, then we had to change the stills and change the still house and change the method of production and the flow line of the whole distillery. And so we brought in a firm of engineers, and they put together plans for us, and we were going to have a new boiler, and we were going to have 2 new stills, and a whole load of piping and tanks and things like that. And they were then faced, of course, with the problem of getting all that to Islay.
Yeah.
So McKelvey's were the transport company that had been given the contract to do that, and they worked a deal with the Navy, and the idea was that a tank landing craft would pick up all the kit in Helensburgh and transport it across to Islay. And because the distillery was on the sea, the tank landing craft would run all the necessary equipment into the distillery, and the operation would be deemed an enormous success. What unfortunately happened was that the distillery manager, who was known locally for his knowledge of climate and everything to do with the natural habitat of Islay, forecasted that they were coming, the tank landing craft, the Navy, were coming a week too early, because the tide wasn't going to be high enough for them to run the tank landing craft into the distillery. He said they're going to be stuck a quarter of a mile out in the bay, in Lagan Bay.
And how were they going to get the stills off the ship anyway?
Because they had a huge crane within part of the equipment.
Yeah.
They had a huge low loader that had the boiler on board, but they had an army vehicle that was basically a crane, and the idea was that it would come off the boat first.
Yeah.
Hawser the big beanie off.
What's big beanie?
It was the tank. It was the low loader that had the boiler on the back of it.
Okay, right. So like just a massive,
huge 12-wheeler that you see going up the road, and this fabulous, immaculate boiler would just be put into the new boiler house, and
with the Navy doing all of that.
They were doing. No, what was happening was the Navy were there to get the boat into the distillery.
Right. So they basically park it up. Your guys would go on.
Our guys from McKelvey's would get the vehicles off, shunt the stuff, the stills, the various other pots and pans around the place, and then back onto the boat and back to Helensburgh.
And did you have to pay the Navy to do that?
We had to pay. Fun enough, it wasn't actually all that much. But what did concern us or me at the time was that they were going off on an exercise soon after they had delivered McKelvey's stuff back to Helensburgh, i.e. the next day. And if they couldn't go, if there was going to be a problem, then they would have to charge us overtime. So I said, well, and this was a Friday afternoon, the best thing we can do is insure it. So I called to Stenhouse at the time, and at 5 to 5, the operation was insured, and not for a lot of money either. So come the weekend, and Babcock's had built the boiler, and Big Beanie picked the boiler up, and plus all the other lorries steamed off to Helensburgh and waited for the tank landing craft coming in, which it did, and everything rolled onto it, and the bow went up, and off we sailed to Islay on the Sunday night.
And you were on there as well?
I was on there, yep. And no fun without punch, you know. And so we get to Islay the next morning, and I look out. I thought, we're a long way from the distillery, and we're not moving. And I said to the first mate, what's the problem? And he said, well, we're waiting for the tide to get up, and we'll run it closer to the distillery. Mm-hmm. Well, the tide did get up, but it only got us probably about another quarter of a mile nearer the distillery, which meant that there was about 400 or 500 yards between the boat and the distillery. So we said, well, what's going to happen now? And they said, well, I think basically we've misjudged the tide.
So your pal was right.
We knew he would be right, because he knew everything of that sort of nature. So what they did was they got the big crane, this huge army vehicle, and it was high enough up that it could run through the tide, because the water was probably, about this deep.
Yeah.
And anyway, it got through and got into the distillery. And so the idea then was that the hawser from the vehicle would be pulled out to the boat and attached to Big Beanie.
What's the hawser?
Hawser's wire.
Right, okay, yeah.
It's a great big thick wire hawser.
Yeah.
And with a huge a hook on it. So it was brought back out and attached to Big Beanie. And Big Beanie they'd strapped a great tarpaulin on the front of it, and started it up, and off it went. I'm up the bridge with one of my fellow directors. Well, this thing got halfway and stopped. And we said to the guys, what's happened? They said, he's stuck on the sand. And the crane isn't powerful enough to pull it off, because the weight of Big Beanie was about 4 times that of the crane. So then they had to rescue the driver, pull him out his cab, and we have some wonderful pictures of literally ducks sailing in one window and out the other window. And the kids all...
it must have been chaos in Islay.
It was absolute chaos.
Quite a sight for them.
Incredible.
Probably the most entertainment they'd had that year.
Well, yeah, and it went on for about another 5 days, 6 days. And so then they had to get Big Beanie back to the boat. So they had to wait for the tide to come up to get the boat closer in and roll Beanie back onto the the tank landing craft, which they did by about Friday morning, I think, or Thursday afternoon.
So a week later, basically.
Yeah. I mean, we left Rue at Sunday, and this is Thursday afternoon. So they get the big Beanie on the boat and get the hawser going. Managed to get the tank landing craft a bit closer to the distillery, and then the big moment happened when eventually it was close enough, and Big Beanie, where they managed to start up the engine, just rolled into the distillery, and then during Friday, they moved all the other equipment and what have you, and the operation was completed on the Saturday, and the boat pulled away on the Sunday morning.
Everyone must have been quite thrilled once that was over then.
Oh, God. There's some pictures there's a picture of me leaning on the harbour wall, looking as though I'm about to be absolutely sick. But anyway.
So it left on it's done on the Saturday, left on the Sunday. What, did you have a party with?
On the Saturday night, we sure did. Yeah.
All the Navy lads were in there as well.
Yeah, we were all great friends by that time.
Yeah, I can imagine a week on the boat, more or less.
I mean, the people who really were incredible were McKelvey's engineers. They were out of this world.
Yeah.
The work they did all the time was fantastic. And the foreman wore a suit, white tie, white shirt and tie the whole time. And what state that suit was in by the time he finished, I hate to think. But he was just incredible.
Oh. Can't even imagine that. I would have been stressed.
It was unbelievable. And as I say now, there's, in fact, later this afternoon, we'll look for those. Because I think
definitely need to get those pictures and videos looked out. I need to see them. That's brilliant. So the stills are finally in. Yeah. What did that mean then? Production went up and
production went up. We were now a 1 million gallon distillery.
Yeah.
And we sold off the John Doe stills, and
how did you do that? There wasn't another Navy ship in.
No, but that's what happened. They were shipped out in the Navy. Yeah.
With what's it, Big Beanie?
Big Beanie, that's right.
Did you call it Big Beanie, or was that its
no?
It
had its name on the top.
I need pictures of this Big Beanie.
It's all there.
Brilliant. So you sold them. Production went up, and then I imagine a few big deals after that, or change of strategy, or
I was looking at a letter that I got from my father, who told me that they'd just done a 2,000 hogshead deal with Chivas, and those were the sort of things that were happening at the time,
and what sort of cost was that looking like at the time?
You mean for
2,000 hogsheads?
Oh Christ! I couldn't tell you.
Fairly substantial though.
Pretty substantial, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, hogsheads, 60 gallons. So you're talking about 2 times 620, about 1.2 million litres or gallons.
Yeah.
Times, that'd be probably £1 million.
Yeah. And those kind of deals, they would have been impossible before Bowmore.
Sure.
Yeah, so that really helped. So you had obviously the shifts, and at this point, it's still putting the spirit into other companies' blended whiskies,
Yeah.
right? There's no single
No.
malt Bowmore at this point either.
No. But it was very interesting because soon after that, my father invited me down to have lunch with Sam Bronfman and his son at Paisley, which they had just built with offices and warehouses and everything under. I mean, the money they spent was unbelievable. At lunch, Sam Bronfman asked my father if we were going to bottle any of the Bowmore. And he looked at me and I said, well, I would like to be able to bottle Bowmore. I certainly think that this is something that we should consider, in the future. Mm. And he said, well, if you can guarantee me 30,000 cases of Bowmore a year, Seagram's will be your distributors in Canada and America. Can you imagine that? Do you know how many cases basically I could actually put together at the time?
How many?
About 300 cases.
Right.
That was top whack.
So that was a no-go, basically.
Total no-go.
And why was that?
Because when we bought the distillery, they had not. There was not a great, not a lot of stock.
Okay, yeah, I get you.
And what there was, basically, my father had sold.
Yeah. So who were the big, after this happened, who were the big partners? Because I know obviously Suntory ended up buying Bowmore, but they came into it quite early on after you got Bowmore Distillery, the Suntory.
Well, you've got to remember we're talking of an entirely different type of business here. Mm. And this was active during the 60s, 70s, and the vatted malt program. Now, somehow Drury's and Old Smuggler had avoided any attention from the unions. But anyway, we started supplying, as did Seagram's, as did Hiram Walker, as did one or two others, start supplying vatted malt to Suntory.
And so for people listening, obviously you explained bulk blend and bulk in the last episode. What is vatted malt?
I'm not actually quite sure where the expression came from, but it was really there to determine the difference between a blended Scotch whisky and purely malt whisky. And it became appropriate, especially for the trade that was about to take place, or had taken place, or in Japan and the various other big markets, which were Brazil and Argentina.
So that you send out those malts, and then these different companies would put that into their different blends.
Yes,
essentially.
Yeah.
I mean, how did that relationship come about?
Because my father had gone out to Japan in the either late 50s, I suppose, and early 60s, and had met with Suntory, had been introduced to Suntory, and also to Nika. And
was that through an embassy as well?
No, personal. I think it came through a contact in the trade who weren't able to do the business that Suntory wanted, or they didn't want to do vatted malt business. Mm-hmm. And so they suggested that as my father was going out, he might like to look up Suntory, meet the family, and then take it from there and see what would come out of it.
Okay, and they had quite a strong relationship straight away. They got on.
Yeah,
and that was
Yeah.
that basically.
It was both as a company and as a family.
Yeah.
Because our family was very close to the Tory family, and my brother was, he was very close, as was our chairman, who in actual fact spoke Japanese as well. So we had a very
That
intimate,
always helps then, doesn't it?
yeah, had a very intimate, not maybe being the right word, but close relationship.
Yeah. Mutual respect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was
And this
obviously,
also helped because we played golf,
yeah.
and the Tory family played golf, and this gave us a one-upmanship on
Everyone else.
and everyone else, because none of the people who were involved in the sales sides of the other companies played golf.
And you're not too shabby at golf either,
Well,
are
we
you?
weren't too shabby either. No. My father was a very good golfer, as was Brian.
As are you, being modest.
No,
So that was one major aspect, the vatted malt to
Japan.
And then you were also dealing with Scandinavia and the US as well.
We were selling bulk. We were dealing with the Swedish monopoly and supplying them with grain whisky and with blended whisky.
And Swedish monopoly is government.
It's government
well.
controlled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And blended bulk, that's where you do the blend yourselves,
Yeah.
send it to them,
Yeah.
and they basically package it, label it as their
Yeah,
own
what
brand.
they do is reduce the strength,
Yeah.
and then bottle it and package it and
As their own.
distribute it. Yeah.
So you would have to be exclusive with that, whoever you were selling it to,
Yeah.
basically.
Yes, what they did with it thereafter, I've
Yeah.
no idea, because we wouldn't have been the only people
Yeah.
dealing with them.
Yeah, yeah. I guess after it's sold, you don't really care, do you? And then...
There was a guy who ran the Swedish monopoly, was the largest buyer of wines and spirits in the world,
Mm-hmm.
because the monopoly bought wines as well as everything else. And and of course the amount of whiskey he bought was huge. Now I always remember we were very friendly with them, and my father and I were invited by him and his family out in a boat in the Swedish archipelago, and it was a super day. And again, that gives you an idea of the personal relationship that you have with these people. But I also remember that 2 days later we were having dinner with them in the Opera Kilarön in Stockholm, and it was, probably the best restaurant in Scandinavia. And so after a fantastic dinner, the head waiter came along and asked if I would like a cigar, and I said no, I'm okay. And so we had a salesman at the time who was with us, wonderful thing, complete piss artist, and he didn't want one, so the box went to Bengt Riesberg, and it was open for him, and he took one out, and the guy takes it, and wherever they do with the things, chop the top off and light it, and sits there, and we have a whiskey and what have you. I get the bill, sit, and then get up to go, and the box of Monte Cristos is tucked under Bent's arm. These fucking cigars were more expensive than the dinner.
And you picked up the tab.
I picked up the tab as well, so...
Client servicing.
Yes.
To the extreme.
Who's going to complain when we got a 1 million gallon order earlier in the day?
How much were they? Can you remember?
No idea. There were, in those days, hundreds of pounds a box. Bearing in mind when that was. 1965, 66, I suppose.
So we made the most of that dinner then, and day out.
Indeed.
So that was Scandinavia, Japan, the US. That was...
And then we had a number of contacts in the US. Again, old established family contacts. The one particular gentleman that we worked with was Sidney Frank, who was the great friend of my father's. He was the son-in-law of the owner of Shenley, which was the second largest liquor company in the United States. But Sidney set up a company called Grey Goose, which is the vodka which we're all now familiar with. And Sidney built that brand up to such an extent that he actually managed to sell it for $20 billion.
That would be nice, wouldn't it?
Oh, that would be very nice.
So he's a smart
Yes.
marketer,
and also
smart guy.
a very good golfer.
Oh,
And
perfect.
that's probably where the association started with my father.
Right, I see.
Yeah. But he became a friend of the family as well.
Yeah, so he bought a lot of bulk from you as well, right?
Yes. So that was the sort of business that we were doing at that time.
So that sort of these different aspects, the vatted malt, the being able to exchange casks with other companies, and the blended bulk, you just continue to grow, I guess, over the 60s.
Yeah.
With those aspects, and 70s with Bowmore, and then obviously you bought Glen Garioch.
Well, what happened was that we then bought Glen Garioch Distillery.
And when was that?
That was in 1969. And I had a discussion with my father because we'd had a board meeting up in Old Meldrum at Meldrum House, because at that time we were administering Macduff Distillery. And so we had a meeting up there. And I just happened to ask, somebody what was the distillery doing in the bar that evening. And they said, oh, it's not doing anything. It's shut. DCL have closed it down. So
you met someone in a bar and heard about this?
Yeah. I mean, we were staying in the hotel.
Yeah.
And so and Old Meldrum House was in Old Meldrum.
Right.
Where the distillery was.
Right.
So, and they said this is what had happened. And evidently the problem was that they couldn't raise enough water to increase production. I mentioned it to my father, and he approached Distillers Company, and they, rather to our surprise, because they could see no solution to the problem, were quite happy to unload it from their portfolio of distilleries.
Right.
So we bought it and set about, obviously, trying to overcome the problem. And the local farmer, Mr. Manson, who was closely associated with the distillery and had been over the years, was of great help to us and suggested that we might be able to solve the problem if, in fact, we were to engage a water diviner. And
what's a
water diviner is a fellow who goes around the place and has some magical being within him that is able, with a stick, to determine where there is water.
underground?
And evidently this stick starts waving furiously, and lo and behold, there is water in a sunken well, or water comparatively close, and so we decided to employ one, and he knew of a fellow that was prepared to help us. And Mr. Manson was of the opinion that actually there might be water up in one of his top fields. And so off he and the water diviner went, and our distillery manager, and they wandered around the place, and lo and behold, the stick starts waving furiously, and we found water, and plenty of it.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, we were able to increase the production at Glen Garioch distillery as a result.
And how did you get the water to the distillery?
We piped it through the fields down to the distillery.
So just dug, we
got a
trail from where the guy's stick started waving, and that was.
And
that.
he was the Manson family, who we had become very close to, and very friendly with, were of enormous help to us. Huge help to us. Both, not just in that, but in many other areas associated with Glen Garioch distillery.
Yeah, I like how both these distilleries have come from conversations you've overheard in a bar as well.
Well, there's a thought. Yeah.
Next time
as long as it's within the wine and the environment of the spirits industry.
Yeah. Next time my mum's giving me stick for spending too much time in bars, I'll remind her.
You're likely to pick up some info.
So that was Glen Garioch, and then after that you were 1970.
1969 I went away.
Yeah, you went to business school.
Yep. Came back 73.
Next episode, we hear about the original pioneers of the single malt whisky category from the late 60s and into the 70s, what went into the design and marketing, and which countries began to adopt this relatively new concept. If you have any questions or feedback you'd like featured in future series, please leave them in the ratings or on our YouTube and social channels, which you can find in the description.